The term graffiti itself is interesting because in our Western culture, we generally refer to graffiti to any kind of informal painting on a wall. The sort of scientific speak is to actually use two terms. One, graffiti is common, graffito, singular, graffiti, plural. But then there's dipinto and dipinti. Now, that is less common. In fact, until I started studying Maya graffiti, I have to confess, I didn't know that the term dipinto existed. But apparently it's out there for people who study these kinds of things. So whenever something is scratched on a surface, that's graffiti. When it's painted, it's dipinti. Dipinti plural, dipinto singular. So it's all from Italian, of course. That's when they started studying those things first, and so the terms kind of stuck. So anything that is painted or scratched, in Mesoamerican archaeology, generally graffiti refers to everything, in part because there are so few actually painted things on the walls. Paint doesn't preserve as well. The notion is that it's always something secondary, so it's not part of the original planning. It can be really nice, right? It still would be classified as dipinti or graffiti if it doesn't look like it's part of the original design. Somebody came in and decided to add things. One thing about graffiti and dipinti, they're often spontaneous, or they look spontaneous. Of course, people classify spontaneous differently. They can be quite premeditated. A lot of our graffiti are, uh, um, perhaps less than architecture, but nonetheless, they can include both text and images. And there's often this notion of repetition. So we see certain spaces welcoming graffiti and dipinti over and over and over. And the assumption is that the audience of graffiti is wider than the audience of people who make formal text. Although that is not necessarily the case. It can be complicated. So when it comes to Maya graffiti and dipinti, the one important thing is, for the most part, if you want to have something on a surface, that surface has to somehow survive to be discovered by an archaeologist. Which means we're still looking at elite structures for the most part, because these are the ones built out of stone with big stone vaults, and things get preserved that way. So unless we assume commoners sneaking into the palaces and doing graffitis, we're still pretty much talking about the same one percenters doing things. It's just they also scratch the walls somehow. When it comes to the caves, paintings in the caves, those are presumably implying membership of a wider social group, but not necessarily so. Those could be the same elites. So this whole argument about who does what, who paints graffiti, is a bit more complicated when it comes to the Maya. Probably the same few people who paint inscriptions are also doing graffiti, but presumably in different contexts, and perhaps more of them. Most of the graffiti come from the 8th century CE, which kind of makes sense. That's the time when things went south. A lot of buildings got abandoned all at the same time, which means whatever they had on the walls stayed on those walls. Instead of somebody like taking those buildings down or repainting the walls, those walls remained. So like a time capsule. Also, obviously, you had generations of squatters or pilgrims or both visiting the same spaces and scratching on the walls as well. So things are a bit more complicated. Now, there are other interpretations of graffiti in a sense like folk art. A lot of it is about perhaps children drawings, because children are in those spaces and they scratch. I mean, everyone who had children knows they produce graffiti naturally, almost immediately in any spaces they occupy. These kinds of formal dipinti, really nice inscriptions, are rare. And so, in fact, there's only one place in the Maya world with tons of those, the cave of Nakhtunich. For some reason, that place was the big pilgrimage center. A lot of elite nobles went there, and they left inscriptions how they did so. So this is where the cave is. Not a very obvious place. Not the center of Maya world, but there, sort of south of the mountains of Belize, the origins of the Mopan River, you have a relatively large cave, spectacular cave. You can see some photos of that. You can still visit it, but for the most part, it's closed because of vandalism. So part of that vandalism is religious vandalism, because you have a few very burning, recently converted evangelical Christians who just love to destroy idolatrous things. And from time to time, they break into places like this cave, and things happen. So that place has texts. And people literally went to the cave and they left like, so-and-so was here, very much like our graffiti. And they say, so-and-so came to the black cave. They apparently call it the black cave or the black waterhole cave. Ich Quainal, or ich, we don't know how to read this glyph. Probably just another variant of the word for and cave, maybe some other term for cave. Or here, the term is bakash, ti, chen. He walked around the edge of the chen, the edge of the cave. And this is an interesting term. We don't see it used very often. It's a verb. It's a verb of motion. It occurs in two contexts, military campaigns and going to the cave of Nakhtunich. And today, present-day Turkey would say bakash when they want to say, like, we went to a town for a walk, like on Sunday, like shopping. That is that you go there and you come back. It's kind of circular motion. So what we see here most likely is that people actually walk through the cave. They do processions, like taking a walk. So it wasn't just enough to go to that cave. You were supposed to kind of crawl through that cave or walk through the cave. And we see those graffiti, and some of them are in a relatively accessible section of the cave, but some of them are not. People actually had to scale shafts in darkness or with like torchlights. And so we see references to bakash. And there are other verbs. Ab appears twice, like going up, because people are scaling up and down through the cave. One text actually mentions descending, kohoi, presumably in one of those shafts. So people went through the cave, left multiple inscriptions. A lot of these texts mentioning that they saw Monpan. And we have no idea what Monpan was. You can see there, sort of midsection of the cave, in the main passages, that's where people saw Monpan. One idea is that that was the actual cave itself, but that contradicts references to the verbs of motion, which mention, different names for the cave. So Monpan could have been a deity. Some people suggested that the fact that the river is called Mopan today could potentially indicate that that was the water deity that was associated with the river. Another possibility is that what they saw was an actual person, like an oracle. It's interesting that the scene acts, they largely cluster very much within a single lifespan, actually less than a single lifespan. You kind of wonder if there was like someone named Monpan or someone speaking on behalf of Monpan. Yeah, like a charismatic hermit of some sort. And people went to see Monpan and they saw Monpan. So it's interesting that most of these visits, they really cluster in this very narrow period of time. So it was like a cult. People went there, it went through a brief burst of popularity, and then it died out. And it's very important. People went to that cave before that, long before that, in terms of ceramic chronology, and they went after. But the moment when a lot of nobles traveled there and left inscriptions, that's a relatively narrow period of time. Very much like present-day charismatic cults. And then people saw other things, like this is some kind of spiritual experience. The person saw the way, the person saw the dream, or perhaps demon of the night. So there's some kind of revelation. Now, there's no evidence of drugs or anything in that cave, as far as we know. But the various sensory deprivation, if you don't eat or drink and you're in complete darkness, or in water in complete darkness, you're going to see things anyway. That's how our brains work. This person says that he saw the carved cave. Presumably, a lot of the cave is modified. The access ways, and then some of the areas where the texts are located, they're apparently smoothened so that you could actually paint. So those cave inscriptions mention kinds of people that no other Maya texts talk about. Prophets. So in this case, apparently there is someone from a local kingdom of Baashtun, and he owns a prophet, Like this is someone who is a prophet of the Lord of Pashtun. Literally, Chichwinik. And Chich means prophecy or any kind of formal motivational speech. So like a motivational speaker would be another way of translating that. Someone who speaks prophecies. Kind of makes sense that in a place like this, you would have professionals. That person is not Monpan, which is important, right? Somebody else. And in this text, the context is not unclear. It's not clear, but they're talking about prophecy. So it's not prophecy person, it's the prophecy that it talks. People went and they apparently had professionals delivering prophecies. Then there's this dude who is called Uba. This is his image. Ach Chichbich, literally the guide who tells the road, who prognosticates the road. So the same word for prophecy plus road. So spiritual guide. And he looks very, like a hermit, right? Naked, with hair, doing probably bloodletting. And he's called Mum. So he's old, and you kind of see the wrinkles, right? Some part of the drawing is damaged, but seems to be doing that. And then this part is unclear. I'm not sure what that sign is. There's a doubler, sis or sihich, probably involving the term gift. And then umuk, it is the omen of chok, of the young. So this is some kind of spiritual leader or guide, hermit, working with young people, living and doing his professional prophecy activities inside the cave. So those were people apparently whom the pilgrims wanted to meet. So some kind of Maya spiritualists. Now we talked about Maya priests, right? These are not priests, right? These are some kind of special cave operating prophets, very much like Christian hermits, right? So holy men, like the real Maya holy man looks like this. Or think about holy men in India, right? Those who basically reject all the trappings of life and who basically fast naked in a cave, not unlike this. And what is interesting, most of the visitors are young people. We talked about youth, and this is the case here. They're, for the most part, young men. There are very few people who carry actual titles, suggesting they're like royalty. There's maybe a couple of holy kings from Altun Ha and the local royal family of Pashtun. We don't know where Pashtun was located. It must have been a minor site in the vicinity of the cave. And the rest are just young men. And it's interesting, there are actually footprints of children in the cave, in some of the deposits of the cave, so you can actually confirm that those were young people visiting the cave. So it was part of becoming an adult, making this pilgrimage, seeing some holy men, prophecies, and then coming back, presumably, to the world of the living, to the normal reality. And it's interesting that this is our cave, and this is the network of people who traveled. And some of them traveled from very far away. What is also interesting is that some places nearby didn't go to the cave. So very much like present-day religious movements or cults, it seems to be restricted to a specific group of people and also to the vassals of the Kanol royal dynasty, but not all of the vassals of the Kanol royal dynasty. So people from Campeche, this area, they travel, and then people along the same trade route or communication route, the mountains of Belize, they also travel. Very few people immediately west of it, say Naranjo, Holmol, those places, they don't travel to Nakhtunich. And we actually have Naranjo pilgrim notes, and they're somewhere here at the site of called San Pedro Cachach. So Naranjo, for some reason, Naranjo individuals traveled west along the lakes, and then they traveled south to a different location. So this is an example of very elaborate dipinti left by pilgrims. Now, most Maya graffiti and dipinti are not like that. This is really an outstanding case. It seems to be related to a specific cult, some prophets, holy spiritual guides, young people traveling from very far away, hundreds of miles sometimes. And it's very narrow in scope, so it's like one generation, then it's over. Most of my graffitis are in buildings, in structures, and this is Homul where I work. This is just a close-up of that area. This is a major site during the pre-classic times, like first millennium BC, first couple of centuries AD. Then it declines, but its satellites, especially Homul, thrive during the classic period, so becoming sort of the main city. But those causeways presumably remain active during most of the time. And there are people still living at Cival during the classic period, to just a fewer people. So people at Homul, they kind of live among the ruins, these ruins of great pre-classic civilization around them, ancient roads cutting through the landscape in straight lines. And all of those date to basically 200 BC to 100 AD. And so we are at Homul. This is Cival. And the first graffiti, they actually come from Cival, as far as we know, from the highest temple at Cival. Unfortunately, we know relatively little about those graffiti because the temple was very hard to excavate. It was in a room of the structure that was covered inside a later version of the same temple. The fill was incredibly dangerous. We only have a few glimpses of what images were like. There were apparently murals there too, like formal mural paintings and polychrome stucco reliefs, but they just remained inaccessible. The only way to get to them would be like to blast through the building from top down, and that would be very destructive, and we didn't want to do that. But in what they uncovered before they encountered problems with the unstable feel in that room, there were a lot of drawings on the walls of the inner sanctum of the temple, and those were not formal murals. They were basically informal drawings, dipinti, of the maize god, but many drawings of the pre-classic Maya maize god. So it's kind of hard to see it as a maize god, but he has this cleft lip and general youthful appearance. We haven't talked much about pre-classic iconography. It's a separate world. So these are all maize gods, but maize gods wearing different headdresses. So this is a maize god lord, and this is another maize god lord, but in a different crown. So different manifestations of the maize god as a ruler, or perhaps seasonal manifestations of the maize god. So it's like people enter the sanctuary of the shrine, and they're thinking, of course, like most Maya do, of corn. And as they think of corn, presumably different times of the year, they enact various rituals communicating with the maize god. And as they do so, they create these drawings, all of these drawings. You can see they're all different in style. The hands are not the same, so kind of multiple events. It looks very much like cave painting, except there are no texts. But it's a cave painting inside the shrine of a temple, suggesting perhaps they think of that temple as a kind of cave in a mountain. So these are the earliest informal images that we have. Of course, informal is a relative term here. This is the sanctuary of the main temple of the city, right? So they cannot be very informal. And these people are obviously familiar with the conventions of Maya art and iconography. Priests, perhaps, or other high-level visitors. But it's interesting that they produce these images, and you can see a lot of them are not full body, they're heads. But of course, in Maya art, head is the key part of the identity. So they're communicating perhaps with a specific maize god, and they want to draw a head so they could actually talk to that maize god.
There's a precursor to using head as glyphs.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, they're using writing at that time too, but we don't see any writing in this space. They're not writing things down. There are monuments at Cival, but as far as we know, no visible inscriptions. So as we move in time, but also in space, south of Cival to Homul, this is what the classic period site looks like. And it's kind of weird because you see these multiple compounds, and basically these are different residences of the royal family from slightly different times. Every time they're hit by something political on a regional scale, they rebuild the palace and presumably start anew. And so you have these multiple variants. Some of them abandoned at some point. Some of them rebuilt. Some of them gradually become ancestral shrines, as nobody lives there anymore except ancestors. So it is in this space that we see a lot of graffiti during the classic period. So this Sufrikai Palace, for example, was occupied late 4th, early 5th, and well, most of the 5th and perhaps early 6th century AD. And this is what it looks like. It's built entirely in Mexican style. So at the time, they're fascinated with everything Teotihuacan, and it has Teotihuacan style murals. What is interesting, though, is that it also has graffiti. It has graffiti of Mexican warriors from Teotihuacan. So it's interesting that the graffiti occurs on a Maya-style mural showing the celestial king of gods talking to a wingless bird, presumably one of those stories in which the bird gets its wings from the celestial king of gods. But someone at some point decided to draw little mats, like symbols of royalty, and warriors, but not Maya warriors, but Teotihuacan warriors wearing the so-called pillbox headdresses and carrying darts. So someone thought that images of Teotihuacan military were so important that it had to be scratched over on Maya-style murals. So we're talking about a time when there was some kind of military intrusion into the Maya lowlands, and it seems to be reflected in the imagery. And this is a Teotihuacan warrior in the next room, who's part of the formal murals, which is also interesting. And there's no graffiti over that mural. The graffiti only occur only over the Maya-style mural in the palace. It seems to be important somehow. Like things you're allowed to scratch over, and there are things you're not allowed to scratch over. Whatever's happening in that palace seems to be important that way. Now, at Naranjo, so we're moving a little south of Homol, right after they emerged from the Teotihuacan sort of related period, this is the main sort of downtown area of the site. This is the main palace. I showed you some graffiti from that palace before. There's an area that was completely buried underneath the early construction phases. We have a series of buildings, each has its own facades, and the buildings are distinct. So that structure, Aurora, is some kind of temple, and I've already shown it's the temple of the local hummingbird deity. It has a frieze showing basically the image of that deity, a giant human hummingbird hybrid on a mountain of some kind, a flower mountain. So that's the patron deity. And inside, there's this space with relatively simply painted walls. They were painted with, white and red. So the bench is red, the main walls are white, and then you have these bands of red marking the corners, the point of intersection between the vault and the walls. And there's a lot of soot. Apparently, there's a lot of smoking inside. Kind of makes sense. And the graffiti, they cover basically the bench, the space next to the bench, and part of the vault. And there's some graffiti here and also some on the door jamb. So what we see here is presumably what the priest was doing, or whoever was occupying that space. So we see a lot of profiles. And you can see it's a palimpsest. It's kind of hard to figure out what is going on. This is not just a one-time thing, but repeated production of images. So human profiles, and that's a common feature of Maya graffiti. And that, of course, starts with those dipinti of the maize god, right? So they just continue doing that, drawing heads. Then there's a Maya fire god, a rather mean-looking fella. He's got a human trophy head in one paw and a torch in another. And then there is a deer who seems to be speared. There are similar scenes of deers and gods holding torches. So maybe they are part of the same composition. It's kind of hard to decide. My colleague Christoph Helmke suggested, looking at this graffiti, that they're in fact part of the set. It's hard to see because there's so much overlapping going on. But it's a relatively decent representation of Maya deer, and it has a caption right next to it, saying basically "fat one for the priest" or "stretched one for the priest." So I suspect that it actually refers to the deer. And then the door jamb says something Ahin priest, and presumably that's the name of the owner of the building. So he literally scratched his name on the door jamb and then provided some captions to the scene with the deer. And then there are counts. I've shown you images of those counts, Tzolk'in and lunar calendar, kind of consistent with the priestly function of the room. And there's at least one cosmogram. It doesn't look much, kind of a circle with a cross, but that's how Maya represent the cosmos, the universe. This is a more elaborate one from early colonial Madrid codex. And there's this right next to it, which is basically like a crossed knot, which is a Maya symbol for tzak, order. That makes sense next to a cosmogram. Now, the interesting part is that this is not the only room with graffiti in that palatial complex. So this is temple, presumably. There's a guy who's a priest. And so we see images of gods, cosmograms. Oh, he also has this weird thing that looks like a shield, if you can kind of see it with feathers, a spear or a dart, and this funny looking mask, which is basically like Mexican storm god. And we know that at Naranjo, where the palace is located, they actually do a particular ritual called Bolon Min Kachkochen. And it involves this kind of battle shield or standard. That seems to be what this graffiti is depicting, just in a very basic form. Of course, it's tiny. That shield is like this big. So, once again, very consistent with what you would expect from a shrine. So some military rituals, fire god, deer sacrifice, reference to the priest, counts of Tzolk'in. Now, this room is right next to it, right? But it's not a temple. Some kind of reception area, perhaps with a throne here, like a royal throne room. And graffiti are different. They're not the same. So door jambs, images of palanquins, or perhaps elaborate structures, kind of very not clear whether these are like handles of a large palanquin, the ones we see in my art, with someone sitting in it under a canopy, and these enormous fans of some sort. It looks like a perishable structure, like a portable structure. Of course, where kings are, the palanquins are also somewhere in that area. That's the experience of people who see royalty. There are also glyphs. And remember, this is the door, the entryway into a temple. Somebody is literally standing, leaning against the entryway and googling or doodling. And so this is someone who is a lord. Ha, something. Unfortunately, it's eroded. A how. So some lord is basically leaving an autograph. Non-local, judging from the title. So basically, signatures by non-local lords. More graffiti of like weapons and shields and warriors. So none of it is available in that other room, right? All of these themes are different. There's another palanquin and another doorway, the same room, right? Glyphs, as I mentioned. Bowl game is depicted in another doorway. And that looks very much like images of the king playing bowl. Actually has a little glyph, 6 something next to it. So, and this is the king on one of his monuments. He literally played ball very often. He called himself the hero twin Hunahao on monuments. He mentioned that his loyalty was like a team member of, in terms of his relationships with his overlords from the Kano dynasty. So we know that for this particular king, ball game was a big deal. And guess what? There are graffiti on the doorways of his palace room, showing him, presumably, or somebody else playing ball. Very similar attire. There's a scene of someone dancing, although I haven't drawn it yet, with like a big wing-like fans, something we see in my art quite a bit. So royal dances. This scene I like because it shows someone standing on what looks like a small altar in front of a stela embedded in a step of a building. That's the first stela of this king. That's how it actually looks like. I mean, it's incredibly close. I mean, it's still speculation to say that it's the same monument, but it looks very much like it. So it's kind of we're in the space of the king, and now things that matter to this particular king, Nakhtunich, bowl game, his first monument dedication, dancing, palanquins, they're suddenly there. So the topics of graffitis are very different. Different room, different themes. This is all pretty much royalty. I like his headdress. He's got some kind of spiritual presence there. Maybe the god, like spreading its claws over the king.
Or like one of the small statues.
I don't know. But we can kind of see that he does have something like this on the monument. There's like a head there. But maybe the same thing, just the way an artist interpreted on a monument and the way a less formal artist interpreted in graffiti. Uh, there's something that looks like a centipede or perhaps a feathered serpent, an important deity in Maya culture and in Mexican Teotihuacan culture. So that's not very obvious, but there is a long body with feathers. Uh, and then there are sets of something that looks like bead-like counts. So also counts, but they look very different. They're like little circles, and each has a maze god head in the middle. And they're in sets of 13 and 30. I'm not sure what they are. It was very hard to document those because they're close to the limits of the archaeological tunnel. Remember, these are tunnel excavations inside buried buildings. So I'm not sure. And you can see they're small. They're like these tiny panels. But this is something that is closer to that priestly setting. This is the location where you had these tiny Tolkien marks in the palace, in the temple's room. So some overlap. Once again, not the same. Remember, we're just 30 feet. These spaces are 30 feet from each other, and they're contemporaneous, part of the same palatial complex. They were sealed at the same time, but the graffiti inside are not the same. And you cannot say that these are squatters because these are all sealed spaces. This just happens that way. Now, back to Holmul, about the same time when they are doing all those graffiti at Naranjo, there's also a palace at Holmul that is being built, a new palace. In this part, in group 2, archaeologists uncovered only one room of that structure. It's one of the lateral rooms. The central room was heavily modified when they placed the tomb of the king in there. So not much is preserved of the original walls or the vault. But the side room is there, and that's what it looks like. You kind of see that it was not originally intended as a sleeping quarter or a throne room, but then someone blocked the doorway entirely. So it used to be an open room with 2 doorways, and then someone blocked one, and then inserted a throne, like a typical Maya-looking throne with a trapezoid niche in the middle, in that space. So the function changed. And that time, presumably, we see graffiti people sitting on that bench, doing things around it. It's a relatively small room. It's probably not the main throne area. That would be the central axis. But things are happening in that space. There are murals, 4 more murals in that space too, suggesting, yes, we're basically in the elite location, right, where people paint the walls with texts. And there could be other figural murals as well that just didn't get preserved on like other walls. Kind of see that the walls themselves, they're not uniformly painted. There are gaps, areas of dark, suggesting there were probably figures, but you just can't see them anymore. But this text, actually 2 different inscriptions. You can see that the size of the characters is widely different. These ones are very tiny, the other ones are larger. But overall, the whole text is about this wide, so it's not a very large inscription. And it probably mentions the dedication of the building somewhere here. And there is one date, maybe 558 CE, something mentioning flint and shield, but the preservation is very bad. What is interesting, though, over the mural, there's actually graffiti counts and human profiles. So all the 4 walls of the building are heavily covered in graffiti, right over those glyphs. And once again, just like with the Naranjo Palace, we can't blame it on squatters. This is a sealed room. The palace, in fact, could not have been in use for more than 20 years, based on what we assume from the dating of radiocarbon dating, the times of the ruin, perhaps maybe 30 at the most. So still a lot of space. I mean, imagine our houses staying for 30 years. Some of them, require renovation at that point too. But we have pretty good temporal constraints here. And that's the western wall, the most comprehensive. terms of the graffiti. You can see this enormous palimpsest of images. I color-coded them sort of with red, blue, and green. Larger figures showing green, smaller are in red, and then some of the weirder geometric shapes are in blue. Sometimes hard to decide what is going on in terms of how many figures you actually see, and that's the problem of studying any kind of complex graffiti set in the Maya, especially in the buildings. Like here, it looks like there's someone standing holding a bag with incense, and you can see the person is probably black painted, not wearing a matte full bodysuit, but more like painted black. It's like a convention cross-hatching for blackness. And the other hand holds a banner of some sort with cloth, and that seems to be what is painted on the cloth. This is not my writing. This is more like Mexican writing. There's somebody with a banner decorated with Teotihuacan glyphs. It's pretty awesome. And in front of it is a captive. But you look closer at the captive, it seems to be that there are at least two different figures there, kind of overlaying. It's not clear which one is actually facing the person with the banner and the incense bag. One of them does. The other one probably does not. That leg seems to be pointing the wrong direction. It has to be that way. Or maybe it's just sloppy drawing. Who knows? It's graffiti. And you can see little images which seem to be unrelated. Figures, well, of the maze god. She's always there, right? From pre-classic time onward. But then some little and rather elaborate images, like, say, a deer, once again speared, a bundle of some sort, a person talking or singing. Very, very small, very high-quality drawings, too. Well, this person seems to be, vomiting something into a little bowl. And when we look at images, of course, we see comparable scenes. So this is an old god, probably in a sweat bath. He just had some balche and he's letting it out. We have a lot of ethnographic descriptions of people vomiting after balche. That was part of the ritual, cleansing. And we also see something similar with tobacco, like when you sneeze in a lot of tobacco and then it comes out. It could be one of those things happening here. But it's interesting, it's the same space, right? So they're graffiti, and these are large images. They're about this big. So very obvious. So we have captives. We have people basically taking drugs of some sort, whether it's alcohol or balche or tobacco, and doing some kind of ritual purification. That's part of that. And a lot of background imagery as well, like additional human profiles. Then there are these images, right? Yaroslav's Zralka, a good friend and colleague, he argues those are probably kids' drawings. You know, simple shapes. A little chapter which we can open as a reading for today. He actually compares his kids' drawings and some of the graffiti. They look uncannily similar. He also published another article which is slightly more elaborate, but the basic argument is the same. So the kids' images, because we expect kids to be in those spaces, and if there are kids, there will be graffiti. It's inevitable. But then if you look at this and you kind of recognize this is the same cruciform cosmogram that we see at Naranjo. It's a priestly drawing, so it becomes a bit complicated. Like, why would kids draw cosmograms? And of course, yes, those images are simple, but what if they're supposed to be ritually significant? Maybe they don't have to be elaborate to have function. But then you have these drawings which look like all kinds of funny little animals, right there. But then it incorporates glyphs too, like little birdies with some kind of glyph-like elements. And animals, of course, could be kids' drawings, could be those images of feasting animals or demons of the night. And these images are tiny. They're also at the floor level, so kind of kids' drawings make sense. Or somebody who just had too much tobacco or balche is basically lying against the wall and scribbling something, perhaps not very proficiently, given the condition. But then you look at this, and demons of the night. There are also images, say, of the maze god cycle. And there's a scene in which he goes in a canoe with animals. And there's this part here that could have been, although it's very eroded, like actual canoe. So maybe we're looking at mythology, like scenes of mythology, rather than just whimsical drawings of funny animals. It's kind of hard to decide because these things are just out there, right? And it's all one wall. Now the next wall, southern wall, has a glyph, my glyph for north, but it's on the southern wall. So it's not very helpful as far as I'm concerned. Like as far as using glyphs to clarify meaning in the graffiti. If I were Maya, I would not have done it, but they did. There's seems to be a hand holding a scepter with a head of some sort, and then there's this very elaborate cosmogram. Those are often called patoli boards because they somehow resemble patolis, and patoli is a traditional game. If you go to on the first floor of this department, there used to be an exhibit called The Games We Play, and we had a patoli board there. And the board represents the world because you're fighting to control the world. But then you have these things scratched on walls, and you cannot obviously use them as patoli boards because you cannot put like patoli pieces on it. So they have some other function. So it's basically a representation of the world, a cruciform and square, and it's a continuous line. That seems to be important too. So someone is drawing a cosmogram. It's marked as north. So it obviously cannot be in relation to the room, at least not directly, because that's the southern wall. And then this is the wall of the bench. It's more eroded. And then the bench itself. This is not my drawing, but you can see there's a lot of drawings going on the bench itself, and the space behind. This is a 3D scan, and you can see the same cosmogram on the bench too. So basically identical cosmogram is now on the bench. It's repeatedly produced in that particular space. And guess what? This particular cruciform shape is unique to this room. It's not attested anywhere else in the Maya world, but in this room there are at least 3 examples. That once suggests that we don't know what is going on with a lot of Maya imagery, we just don't understand Maya iconography, our sample is too small. And second, that this is a very deliberate act in this particular space. There's also another fellow doing the same vomiting thing. So you have one wall with the big image of guy vomiting, and the opposite wall has an identical image, about the same size too, right behind the bench. So once again, repetition, and guess what? Like at Naranjo, we've seen no images of people vomiting, like not a single. Here we have 2 cruciform cosmograms, not a single one. Here we have 3. You can kind of see there's another, it's kind of cut out by the PowerPoint, but there's another cruciform shape on that wall right next to the one on the bench. So once again, a lot of repetition, and same thing, things restricted to a particular room, like different activities. It's not like random people coming in and drawing. This seems to be very purposeful and repetitive. I think repetition is very important here. That palace is filled in when they put the royal burial in it, and they construct a temple on top. This is the temple, and the temple has a beautiful frieze. The king rising as the sun, surrounded by the nobles and the commoners. You've seen that. It actually has graffiti too, inside the temple. Those are very elaborate. I'm still drawing them. It's been more than a year. I'm occasionally giving up on that particular wall. It's very hard to interpret. It's a very complex palimpsest of images. There are hieroglyphs there too, saying the god, he takes the god. So obviously, it's very appropriate for a temple setting, right? Someone takes the god. Doesn't clarify who took the god or which god. And then the bulk of the imagery are people in helmets kicking each other, like gladiators. And that seems to be the main thing. And there are multiple images, repetitive images of people in helmets basically beating the crap out of each other. So that is, once again, unusual. Like, why are they doing it? And once again, different from all other buildings in that area. And you see some of them are fighting, and they're wearing equipment which is also ball game equipment. And of course, my term for ball game Pete's, it refers to people running around with a rubber ball, but it also refers to people fighting each other like gladiators with handstones. Seems to be part of the same activity from the emic perspective. And some of them you can see they're wearing elaborate headdresses. This is the part where the god is taken. It's just not very visible here. There's a large graffiti showing a human-like humanoid figure. That perhaps that deity that is being taken. Hard to decide. And this little maze god spirit, or cannot avoid that, of course. This is that shrine, and this is the ball court. They're very close. So people doing those gladiatorial fights or ball games, they're doing it here, and then they just walk up the steps and they live graffiti. Seems to be the case. And it's not the only case when people argue that the ancestral cult and ball game are related in Maya lowlands. It's not the only case when you have an ancestral shrine and ball court like close to each other. To my knowledge, no one ever tried to connect it to graffiti. That seems to be part of the repeated ritual. Why they're fighting, why they're drawing blood. This is an image of, in this case, dwarves from El Peru. These are figurines of dwarves, but they're wearing the same kind of gear, a helmet, and one arm is fully padded for like fighting. So that seems to be part of the ancestral ritual, part of the Maya funeral ritual. These gladiatorial fights to honor the ancestor somehow, communicate with the ancestor. So they're doing it over and over in this particular space. And once again, none of it is in the palace. None of it is in any other space. What is interesting, though, this shrine is at some point filled in, and they start building a new one. And we cannot say much of the superstructure is gone. It's eroded away, collapsed. But the corridor of one of the sanctuaries is preserved, and it has the same ball players in it. And patoli boards. So we see a continuity of themes. It's like the same spot across multiple generations, suggesting that these are certain activities which produce this graffiti. They're not random. Nearby, so we were here, and this is a nearby architectural group. There are graffiti too. There are some very interesting images there too. So in this place, you have a massive pre-classic platform. This used to be a shrine of presumably celestial god, because the images of this called principal bird deity, the winged manifestation of the creator god, the heads of the creator god, the size of this board, like enormous stucco facades. And then on top of that, at some point, they're starting putting the dead bodies of the kings and building little shrines, which get bigger and bigger and bigger eventually. So that process starts around 500, actually 450 AD, then continues. There's one burial around 570. There's another one around 590, and it just keeps happening. This is one version of that shrine, the largest one that is still standing. There may have been another structure that covered it. It's gone entirely, and massive looting didn't help. They plowed straight through the main structure and it collapsed. So we know very little. But in the space of the shrine, we actually have burials. There's a cist burial underneath the throne in this room, and then there's an extended burial underneath the floor of the front room. And at some point, people kept entering through this corridor, and they presumably reopened the doorway and then closed it again. At some point, it became permanently closed, and people elaborated the closed door as a stairway into nothing, right? So like the doorway itself is like false steps leading into darkness. It's a very interesting representation of like entrance into the underworld, to the realm of the ancestors. And there are more offerings against these steps, like burned ceramics and evidence of incense burning. So presumably people continued coming in through this corridor for quite some time, even after these rooms were sealed. But the assumption is that they were open for at least a century. I mean, people could basically break through, place additional offerings, and then leave. And that just kept happening between about 615, when these burials were placed, and 692. So when archaeologists uncovered these spaces, they were literally covered with stuff. Like the whole floor was full of broken ceramic vessels, whole ceramic vessels, jade. That seems to be an accumulation of offerings. And it's interesting, a lot of the breaks, a lot of broken vessels, they're not complete. So presumably part of the ritual was to break something, then take parts of it elsewhere. So people would take those and probably leave it in the foundations of their houses or ancestral shrines, like spreading the energy. Remember, it's like relates to this notion of individuals, right? How we all blend into others, and the same thing applies to objects. So a lot of offerings here are incomplete offerings. And their graffiti and their inscriptions. This is the date depicted on one of the walls, roughly reconstructed 615, very, very badly preserved. There's a jade with an inscription mentioned on the ruler from around 615 as well. So that kind of anchors at least the initiation, the beginning of the rituals in that space. And also confirming that we're in a highly privileged location. Kind of makes sense. The tallest shrine, the central axis of the tallest shrine in the city, and this is the personal gift from the most powerful king of that time, Yuknom Tichan of Tsibanche. So apparently at some point he just gave his necklace to the local ruler. Remember what we talked about in terms of personal possessions and extension of self. This must have been a tremendously personal and significant gift. And it was deposited in that space. Now, I don't know what Maya thought as they opened the room, but presumably if you were a Maya, you were opening a gap in that false stairway and crawling inside, you would see another blocked stairway, which of course we now opened, right? The passage. That would be the realm of the ancestors, pure and simple. And you would be kind of in a foyer, in an antechamber, like fronting the realm of the ancestors, deep within this artificial mountain of the shrine. It must have been a very special location. I can imagine probably a lot of things here would be perishable items, which are no longer there, like garments, perhaps banners, things out of wood. All those things are gone, of course, now. Kind of hard to guess. But there are graffiti on either side of the entranceway, and the graffiti on the opposite side, on the entranceway, basically outside. For some reason, there are no graffiti on these walls, like on the side walls. Those seem to be important. Only the ones facing the tomb and the ones facing the opposite direction. And the symbolism here is once again different from everything else we've seen so far. It's military banners. And these are large. They're like this big. And what you see is basically like a shield or a fan on a pole with additional feathering. And this is a flintstone, right? With little mouth and eyes. People in Mesoamerica depict weapons because they're always hungry for human flesh. And they're alive, of course. Like the god of flint at Yashtilan, the flinty lord. So here's a depiction of a living weapon as part of some kind of battle standard. Then there's this text, the 615 date. Unfortunately, part of it is gone. And this part is very unusual because it shows something with a humanoid face and feathers, but it's connected to what looks like a bundle of some sort, like wrapped entity. And of course, we know that ancestors and gods, they primarily exist as bundles. They're not necessarily depicted in a fully humanoid form. They don't exist in fully humanoid form. They're more like garments which can be worn and it can be put away sometimes in the bundled format. So this would be some kind of mask attached to a pole-like bundle of stuff. And you can imagine probably the room contained those as well, like real bundles. And you have this generally humanoid picture that seems to be basically number 9 personified. Of course, nine, remember, it means many or without count. So once again, something else. This is the opposite wall. It does have a few profiles. Some of them look very geometric. Others are more elaborate. And yet another banner, right? You can see that as a shield. This is how I depict shields because they have human skin stretched over the central part. So you see like basically a stretched face with holes for eyes and mouth. So once again, very militant. And instead of showing a sort of an abstract front face, this seems to be a more elaborate sort of flint in profile as a head, like the Flint Lord with its kind of sharp end. So once again, and yet another one of those, I don't know what they are, darts or yet another bundle. So once again, nothing like images we've seen before. And we are at the same site, we're looking at roughly contemporaneous stuff. It's just different things are happening in different spaces at a Maya site, and graffiti seem to be reflecting that. So they're communicating using writing, but also using these visual images. And we also see things which we don't see very often. So these are presumably banners that people carry in battle. And we see these banners, of course, in the scenes of Maya processions. So if we go back and we look at how people go through the cave of Nakhtunich, this is what we see. Here they are. They're all extending. Or they're carrying those things. And we haven't seen them much except on the palace door jambs at Naranjo. We've seen something similar there as well. Like those. So it's kind of interesting how some things seem to overlap. So this is presumably a shrine of the king, and it's decisively militant in nature. Like a shrine of a warrior king. And ball game rituals are not happening here because they're happening elsewhere. We don't see a lot of people in helmets and ball players. But guess what? At the site of Church Kitam last summer, my colleague uncovered a temple that looks very much like the shrine with the frieze at Homul. And inside their graffiti, people wearing helmets. And they're about the same time frame. They're the mid-6th century. And that suggests that this is not just crazy people at Homul doing weird things. This is a custom of some sort that existed across several sites, the same time frame. And graffiti are part of those rituals. They have to be produced. And not because people want to see them, but because presumably making them is part of the ritual. Creating a permanent mark enables the performers, the participants of the ritual, to achieve their aims, the ritual aims of communicating with the ancestor, with the divine. These are, of course, banners and personified weapons, right? We see those. These are Lakam officials carrying banners. This is our Flinty Lord. This is an animate representation of the sun, right? The G3 of the Palenque tribe. This is what his idol is like. It's not like a person, but weapons. The shield with the face of the fire god and these personified lances, and centipede mouths and flintstones. So this is what we see in that space. And that presumably is what happens when they venerate this ancestor. Perhaps they bring like trophies to that ancestor, images of victories. So that ancestor is more militant in nature for some reason and requires these things. So each of these sets of graffiti, they basically unveil a slightly different aspect of classic Maya culture. A ritual ball game or fighting of some sort, military banners or trophies, um, vomiting, ingesting, mind-altering substances, and drawing cosmograms on the walls. All these activities are happening about the same time, or like at least within 1 century at the same archaeological site. We're just lucky that we have so many buildings that were uncovered and the graffiti are preserved. But presumably if someone does the same thing, they'll pretty much get similar data sets if they're in the same time period, which I think is also interesting. Now we're looking at Naranjo. At Naranjo, for example, I see no ball players wearing helmets. But maybe we haven't found the right building yet, the ancestral shrine. Once we find the ancestral shrine, we see the same ball players again. So that's kind of interesting here. And we can actually begin to see patterns and make predictions to see whether or not our models are right, correct. So if we find a third ancestral shrine, for example, in the same region with a similar roof decoration and ball players wearing, or gladiators wearing helmets, that'll be a strong indication we're on the right track, that we're really looking at a pattern here. And Tieshan, of course, they talk about summoning the spirit of the weapons, the Kawilil of Tok Pakal. So this animation of weapons seems to be important. And that's what we see here. It's personified entities other than human persons, which in this case seem to be mediating the ancestral cult. So to summarize this discussion of Maya graffiti, there seems to be a relationship between function and theme. And I deliberately avoided our most recent data set of graffiti, which is from Cival, and it's a completely open space hole of some sort that has only columns and no benches. It's like a large banquet-like space. And a lot of depictions of dancers, but also people in processions. So perhaps there's a relationship there too. It's not unclear what the unit of analysis should be when we look at Maya graffiti. Does it have to be a room or a building or a context, say an ancestral shrine with a bulwark next to it? But it's interesting that we can start thinking about those details when it comes to Maya graffiti. Many previous studies of Maya graffiti emphasized whether it's simply just, could it be kids' drawings or not? But here, obviously, we're looking at something a bit more complicated in terms of how these things are actually produced. It's important to consider emic notions of self, like why one room would have only animate weapons and almost no people. The other room would have people, but only wearing ball game helmets. The third room would have people, but only vomiting. This notion of what really matters, and of course the notion of repetition is important here. So each set that I showed you has some repetitive themes, which I think is also interesting. And once again confirms that graffiti are part of ritual life. They're deliberate, they're important, and then they create some kind of mark on those spaces. They're place creating. If you enter this room, presumably you see all these graffiti, and you realize this is the place where people spiritually cleanse. You see one person cleansing, you see another person cleansing, you see cosmograms, which basically connect to the place, to the great beyond, which is very good for spiritual cleansing. But then you also see militant themes and hieroglyphic inscriptions, and kind of hard to imagine all that, but that's what was going on. There's, of course, much more to understand about Maya graffiti, but I hope you enjoyed this glimpse